wanted to close today because, I mean, we could talk all day about this subject, and I'm going to be on the 605 Super Podcast as well, talking about it. But obviously, Bobby the Brain Heenan passed away this past weekend. And, of course, he's been in ill health or health challenges or just suffering the effects of previous health challenges for quite some time now, probably about 15 years since it started. And, you know, it was one of those bullshit things that Bobby Heenan, the guy who was the quickest wit and the greatest talker, you know, ended up having health injuries, complications, whatever, that led to him not being able to talk and communicate with people. And that was because I just sit back and think, Brian, what now, if in the past 10 years, especially with what's going on with podcasts and one-man shows, I don't know if Bobby at his age anyway, if he was in fine health, if he would want to, you know, leave home and travel around, he would want to do it some. But you think that he could done as much as he wanted to, that anybody would want to book Bobby for one-man shows around the country or the Legends Fan Fest, or, you know, he would be doing a weekly podcast and just, you know, because he was an entertainer. He just had it in his bones because he was a kid. He was a fan that grew up watching this stuff and not only knew how wrestling worked, but knew how entertainment and timing worked and delivery. And it just, you know, he was all around, as Jim Ross had said, and Jerry Lawler, I believe, said, I would vote for it. Bobby may have been the best all-around performer in the wrestling business because he was a pretty high-level worker. And he was a great talker and a tremendously successful manager and a famous Hall of Fame color commentator. And I think maybe the only things he didn't do were stuff he didn't have time to. So anyway, I've told you the story how I first actually saw out-of-town wrestling here in Louisville before I saw the local stuff. Bruisers TV show from Indianapolis came on late on Saturday nights in a station in Bloomington, Indiana, that was close enough with the antenna and, you know, in the good weather. Channel 3 in Louisville went off the air. All of a sudden you could get a snowy picture on Channel 4 and watch this, what looked like 1950s Dumont network television wrestling, because all the major principals had been stars at that point on that show. And that's where they all learned and trained. But it was doing huge business because I accidentally stumbled into watching Dick the Bruiser's Indianapolis TV show right when Sam Miniker had come in as booker. And they brought in a bunch of, which I didn't know that then. I thought he was a TV announcer. And they'd brought in a bunch of talent in the territory, more than they'd ever had before, because they were challenging the Sheik in Detroit. And the promotional war was doing well up there where both companies were drawing big. And Indianapolis, they got Indianapolis cooking to where it was drawing 10,000 people plus a show. And they shot their television at the events at the Expo Center, the house show, every 2 or 3 weeks. And then if another big star was coming in at the next show, they just show a rerun, like on the third or fourth week or whatever they need to fill in, that featured the Sheik or featured whoever was coming in. But it didn't matter because they were hot, and the talent was the Blackjacks, Lanza and Mulligan, and Baron von Raschke, and Ernie Ladd, and Handsome Jimmy Valiant, and Bobby Heenan was managing all the top heels, and Dick the Bruiser, and the Crusher, and Cowboy Bob Ellis. I mean, they were older then, but they were deep in Hall of Fame level talent, and they weren't that old in the early 70s that they still couldn't do a little something, right? So the fucking territory's on fire, and all of a sudden I start watching it. So naturally, when I found the Tennessee territory here on television, it was a studio TV show. So to a 10-year-old kid, you're like, well, you know, those guys are good, and I like to hear the interviews and everything. But it was like, because this was a big arena with 10,000 fans going insane, this must be the big name stuff, right? And Dick the Bruiser's in every goddamn wrestling magazine. But the thing that I remember from my friend, then I started getting kind of smart. Okay, I understand they have matches at the Louisville Gardens, and they're talking about those, and that's a big arena. I wasn't getting to go there at that point, but I still knew that Indianapolis, if they had 10,000 people, that was more than the Louisville Gardens seated to begin with. Right. So this is the way us young kid marks thought back in those days before everybody got fucking smart. Anyway, but with all of those names and all those great heels and all the, Yukon Moose Cholak was the local baby, and Sailor Art Thomas, these classic baby faces, Midwest, versions. Heenan stood out. Most of the stuff that I remember before the days of videotape and before I was even taking notes and writing everything down that happened on TV, most everything I remember involved Bobby Heenan. Either as Bobby Heenan's promos when he was doing the angle with Sam Miniker, and Miniker was coming out of retirement as this ex-wrestler karate expert that was going to put an end to the evil pretty boy Bobby Heenan. Or when Bruiser and Crusher brought in the midget Little Bruiser. And, it took on, was it the Blackjacks? Oh, my God. Or was it, nevertheless, Heenan's guys and Heenan. And Bobby gets beat up by the midget. Or he comes out and he's training for Miniker. And he goes to tear the phone book in half and ends up tearing 14 pages on the cover. I stole all this stuff. In Tennessee, I was watching all these great managers, Sir Clements, Sam Bass, Ken Ramey, George Harris, George Crybaby Cannon, but Bobby Heenan formed for me what a manager was supposed to be. And at first I was cheering for Miniker to beat him up and Bruiser to beat him up because that's what you're supposed to do, right? But he grew on you, and I could understand now as I started getting smarter into business as time went on before he finally left and went to work for Vern. He got heat, but he was still the star of the show. And he was still the most entertaining guy. But it was all because you believed that he was this pompous putz that needed to get what was coming to him. And every time Bruiser touched him, he'd explode. He'd bleed every time Bruiser looked at him, breathed on him. But he could work and he could fucking talk and do all that shit and all the stuff that I stole from him because it was memorable. And the bumps that he not only took manager bumps, but he was a better worker than anybody he managed except for fucking Bockwinkel and Stevens. So you remember when finally Bruiser or Crusher or whoever the fuck, or Andre, when they'd bring Andre the Giant in, it'd be to get Heenan. When one of them would finally get their hands on him and they'd shoot him across the ring and he'd take that upside down over the top backwards fucking bump. Or he'd goddamn get the color, or he'd fucking be flying around the ring with the backdrops and the fucking bump off the bolo punch. He was the one that they wanted to see get his ass kicked. And he did it quite a bit. Now, I tried to pattern myself after that. I wanted to be the guy on the card that they most wanted to see get his ass kicked. But Bobby was able to get his ass kicked week after week and juice and fucking be sodomized and still come back and have heat. And I think if they'd have beaten me, if I was as good a worker as Bobby, where they could get those bumps out of me and they had beaten me up like they beat him up, I don't know if I'd had any heat. But he kept it. The one, I can't remember everything I stole because some of it was just subconscious at the time. But I did the telephone book tear. And I remember when he did I never did this, but Miniker was supposedly a karate expert, and he breaks a brick with a karate chop, right? So then Bobby comes out, and this big wind up, and he hits it. Of course, he sells his hand. And God damn it, he said, there's a metal bar in that brick. And Bobby reminds me a lot of Lawler because the cells were like Ralph Cramden. Jackie Gleason on the Honeymooners, right? They were, and the expression and the body language and the agony that you in the up and down. He knew how to do that shit. So I think that everybody that saw him, and we're going to talk about this on your program, but everybody that saw Bobby Heenan in the WWF, he was great with Gorilla Monsoon and as kind of he wasn't going for heat then. He was going to be the butt of the joke because that was his job and be, funny and entertain people, especially when he wasn't managing anymore because of his neck. But to miss the Indianapolis Bobby Heenan that everybody in town wanted to fucking murder and would go to jail to get a piece of. And had all those great bloody fucking matches where he was the center of attention. And then in the AWA, the Vern Gagne stuff, where, you know, he led the top premier elite in-ring workers in the business and was kind of like the institution there, as far as the heel manager stable. You know, you got to examine all that too. I have droned on so long.
I've always known what a big influence Bobby was on you. You are someone a lot of fans always said was the best manager ever, and you've always stopped people and said, nope, no, it wasn't me, it was Bobby Heenan. You always did that. And of course, one of those times hell froze over in the summer of 93, and you showed up on WWF Monday Night Raw. It was one of those moments that stuck with a lot of people, stuck with me. You didn't just show up. You got in the ring and were embraced by Bobby Heenan, the two greatest living managers here together. What was that experience like?
Well, and he's given me the big build-up because a lot of the WWF fans may not have known who I was because I'd been on WCW, but he embraced me, and he not only heat but credibility with that audience. So when he makes a big deal, and oh my God, look who it is! It's Jim Cornette. He's the greatest manager of all time. Holy shit! I've joked they had to shoot me from the waist up because I had a fucking chubby, you know. But he was just so good, and he didn't mind at all. He was trying even harder than they told him to put me over and get me over and everything. So that was a highlight of my career. And the thing is it's once again, it's almost been a rib of my timing. I never, by the time when I got into business for the over 10 years, I was never in the same place as Bobby Heenan. And then finally I come to the WWF where he's been for almost 10 years, and he leaves like 6 weeks later. We got to hang out at a few TVs, right? And then basically when WCW closed down, he was pretty much retired, but we started doing a few of the Legends Fan Fests. And this is right when he started having his health problems. But we could still have some fun. We did the Legends pay-per-view where he managed the Armstrong family and I managed all three of the Midnight. And I still have the brass knucks that he used to knock me out that he autographed to me in my office. And he gave me a chair from the Market Square Arena in Indianapolis the night that he managed Sheik against Dick the Bruiser, and a shirt, an outfit that he wore on a number of the big WWF events and everything, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, because he had been to the house and seen I collected all this shit. But anyway, we did a few of those, and I got a chance to work with him some with Ring of Honor because we did the Straight Shooting Series videos, and he managed a team against me a couple of times. But then that's when he had the health relapse, and since then he hadn't been able to communicate. So I selfishly would have thought, boy, I would have loved to have been like his, stooge on the one-man shows, and here's Jim Cornette to do something or whatever. Or just there's so many different ways that we could have worked together, but we were never in the same place at the same time. And finally, when both of us would have been able to do something is really when he couldn't anymore. So I really hate that I missed out on that.
One of the Straight Shooting Series DVDs has you given Bobby a tour of your personal museum, of your office, seeing all the really cool wrestling memorabilia that you have up. What was that like for you? Because you're not just giving a tour of all these things you care about, you're giving them to Bobby Heenan, who had a big impact on you, and you can clearly see how much he's enjoying it in that video.
Well, yeah, because he's a big fan too, and especially stuff that would bring back memories of people that he knew. And of course, we had just moved into the castle here about 6 months previously. So a lot of stuff was still, in boxes, or we're just grabbing things. So there wasn't any rhyme or reason to it. It was what I had out at the time, but it was just because we could say something, one of us, usually him, about almost anything that got picked up. So because he loved the wrestling business. That's why he got in it. That was the joke. The first time that he worked, his debut was in Louisville here at the Gardens. And they had him show up at the office, and he didn't know what for, and it was to ride down here to Louisville. And they announced that he was going to be, manage the Assassins. but one of them didn't show up that night. And it was the Midwest Assassins. I can't even remember who they were at that point. Somebody will tell me and shame me for not knowing. But so he had to work as like the partner, stand in the corner and just do what he was told. And one of the fans tried to attack him. And then they get back in the locker room, and Wee Willie Davis, who was the local promoter and also worked at the sheriff's department, got in a fucking fight with Johnny Valentine, and Wee Willie Davis was smacking Valentine over the head with a fucking nightstick or a slapjack. And goddamn, then they get in the car to go back to Indianapolis, and they're crossing the bridge over the Ohio River here into fucking Jeffersonville. And there's a goddamn flaming car wreck. And the way Bobby told it, he said they've got all the ambulances and the vehicles and the car's on fire. And here comes some guy with his hair on fire running across the bridge. and they get back to Indianapolis, and they paid him like fucking $20 or whatever. And he said, maybe 10, I don't know. He said, when can I do this again? He loved it. He wanted to do it.
What was it like when you would see him at all these conventions? Obviously, you guys formed a relationship, and even though he was in ill health, he did make a lot of appearances, more than, it's actually surprising how many appearances he made in ill health. But what was it like when you saw him there? And obviously his communication skills it's hard to even describe what they were, but he was able to communicate somewhat. So what was that like for you?
Well, yeah. And plus, he liked to do it on some occasions to just get out and see the fans again and just get out and do something. But he'd had the problems with falling in different places when he went out to the wedding in Las Vegas that time and I think broke his shoulder. And so traveling was getting more difficult for him. But the last time that I saw him was at the Charlotte Fan Fest. The last time he was there, I can't, whether it was year before last or whatever, but even though he couldn't really talk, and Cindy, his wife, would come along with him, and she kind of helped interpret because they were together so much. She kind of, got it better. But he had a cane with him, just a walking cane. And every time a girl or a woman would come by for the photo op, he's sitting on the stool, or they come by for a photo op or whatever, wearing a skirt, he'd take the cane and lift the back of it up, woo, and with a little whistle thing. And oh my God, and they'd jump and everybody crack up. It's Bobby. I mean, he could have, got away with anything, but he was there. It's just he couldn't convey it. So that was, that was the sad thing.
He actually managed Bockwinkel in Memphis at least once, right?
Yeah, twice, I believe, because I think he was there when Bockwinkel defended against Handsome Jimmy that one time, but I know he was there. The first time I saw him in person was the first Bockwinkel-Lawler match. First time I saw Bockwinkel in person in 1978 when they joined the AWA. And I went down and for whatever reason, and I was shooting color film that night, and the Coliseum, the lighting used to be iffy as to how your pictures would come out because they didn't have the standard ring lights, etc. But anyway, point is, too late. My goddamn pictures of that match came out classic. I got like a 4 or 5 page color spread in the Japanese Gong magazine. I still have the pictures here. They just turned out incredible, including one of Bobby and Nick standing there with that big belt. And that's, I mean, they did the double head bonk spot, and Bobby was just cool at ringside. And Bockwinkel was such a pro. So it was just, you could tell it was a step above the normal schlub that would come in the territory.
I know in the 80s you were not a fan of WWF TV and you probably rarely watched it, but did you get a chance to see any of his work with the Heenan family? Of course, one of the biggest things ever was him being with Andre when Andre turned heel. That's one of the biggest moments in wrestling history leading up to WrestleMania 3. But did you get a chance to actually see any of his work with the Heenan family in the WWF?
Yeah, I mean, I would get tapes on occasion, those were the ones you'd zip through. And also, and Norman Dooley was making me highlight tapes at the time. So if Bobby Heenan was involved, he would put him on it. So I saw a lot of those main event matches. And of course, anytime Bobby's in there taking bumps or doing things, I'd want to see it. I truthfully didn't watch as much of the primetime stuff and on location. I saw the highlight video that the WWE had done that they aired on Raw, and a lot of the location stuff and all the funny haha. Bobby was great at it. I didn't sit down and watch all of that because also we were all on the road all the time too, and I was a little fed up with the comedy direction that things were going. But Bobby was almost like, I guess, the managerial version of the Undertaker, in that it was preposterous, but that guy could get away with it. Or with the hardcore Mick Foley, it's preposterous, but that guy can get away with it. Bobby could be as funny as he needed to be or as he wanted to be, but still somebody that could turn around and get heat from a crowd when he was managing a wrestler. So he could get away with doing that shit because it wasn't like he was putting on an act. That was the brain. That was the weasel, whatever. So anyway, I saw the WWF stuff. And then, of course, when we were in the midst of the Monday Night Wars, and I would try to watch, because I was up in Stamford in the office, so I'd watch the other program. It was nice being able to hear him. And I got a kick out of it. And I've still got the tape here somewhere, but I marked it and saved it the night that he was at ringside and Pillman fucking mugged him basically. And he said, fuck. You remember that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And for the people who don't know, it was Brian Pillman, right before he left WCW, and did the loose cannon gimmick and actually got a release to go to the WWF to do his gimmick, blah, blah, blah. Bobby, and I asked Bobby about it. He said he wasn't really sure about Brian because he hadn't been around Brian from the start like I had. So he was seeing what he was seeing, and he wasn't really sure about whether the guy was safe or not. And Bobby's neck, he'd had the neck surgery. Ultimate Warrior broke his fucking neck. And that was why he quit managing, and he couldn't, certain things you couldn't do with his neck. And when Brian rolled out of the ring and just kind of horse collared Bobby sitting there in the announce chair at the announcer's table, and was just kind of roughing him up from behind, hiding behind him because of the heel, the babyface was coming after him. Bobby's got the headset on and just, what the fuck are you doing? So I saved that, and then he got up and had to walk it off. He was so fucking hot. He walked off and then came back later on. But stuff like that I'll never forget. Bobby was entertaining for the majority of the time he was in the fucking business. He was a child prodigy. He started in 65. He was in a main event combination with Jack Lanza. By the time he was in 67, he was 22 or 3 or whatever. And when I talked to him and got a chance to not only read his books, but we told stories, it was an eerie parallel to me. He lived with his mom. He was trying to support her and his grandmother, which he eventually did through wrestling, but he'd been a hanger-on at the matches. Got involved at a young age. And, of course, he was more athletically gifted than I was. And the thing is, he wasn't even athletically gifted. He didn't give a shit about athletics as far as participating in them. But goddamn, what a bumper and what a worker. It was insane that he picked that up like that. And it's not like he was a goddamn former NCAA All-American. But he was a better worker than many of the guys that he would manage. So at any rate, I guess that's the one thing. I'm glad I got to do the things I got to do with Bobby. I'm certainly glad that I started watching him when I was young and impressionable, because I learned all the good stuff and I was able to steal his shit and make people think I was good with it. But if there's any regret whatsoever, it was just not being able to work more with him by being in completely opposite places for so long. And then finally, just never have any opportunity. I think that would be, what I would change. But otherwise, if you want to be a manager, you want to be like Bobby Heenan, one way or the other. I think you almost had to.
He's universally been considered the best manager ever. I think Heyman has said it. I know you've said it. So I feel like so many people who later went into managing.
J.J. Dillon, J.J. and I agreed at the Charlotte Fan Fest a few years ago when we had our Mark picture taken with Bobby that is on my office wall right now. And so JJ agrees. Heyman says so. I say so. Well, fuck it. Book it. Bobby's the best. The debate is over.